So we've been moving on now through this first part. Now, like I said, these first few weeks, as I described for you when we initiated this thing, obviously these few chapters are just big time significant for really a full understanding of the Scripture as a whole, and that's why we're taking the time to really sort of work our way through this. We'll come to a part tonight which will move us actually into chapter 3 next week. We won't deal with it from that point on in quite the detail that we're doing now because we're trying to get the whole of the book. But if you're going to understand the completeness of the book, then you got to understand the foundations, and that's why these first few chapters here, or first couple chapters I should say, are really significant. So last week we talked about this. We talked about the creation of man versus the forming. Remember, he's formed from the dust of the ground because it already existed, dust. But the creation of man is the breath of life in his nostrils that then makes him a soul, gives him a soul and a spirit. We touched on last week a little bit. It's hard for me to remember exactly where we got through because I can't mark things on the slides here. And by the time I get back to this, I'm like, oh man, did I cover this or not? So I may be covering some ground that we've already looked at, but it doesn't do that. That'll just help us if we reinforce a little bit. But we talked about the concept of Eve, that she was brought from the side of Adam. And as I've been studying the Hebrew and stuff, I'm telling you, I've been finding some amazing things what actually happened there. But it's so much more than God just took a rib from Adam after he knocked him cold. Took a rib. There's so much more that's going on there. But that's for another time and another point, because what's really being said there is absolutely stunning when you see it within the original framework. But nevertheless, so God takes her and he forms her from Adam's side. And she, of course, therefore is his equal, and we did talk about this a little bit last week. But remember that Adam is created, or formed, I should say, and created outside of this place called Eden, and then God establishes this place called Eden, and that's where he puts the man. And it's within Eden now, the Garden of God, which is what Eden means, that man actually from Adam's side forms the woman to be his companion. Now remember the significance of all of that, and the significance of was God bringing all of the animal kingdom to pass Adam, was so that Adam would understand that he needs something beyond the basic creation. Okay, in other words, the need that Adam has is not going to be found in creation and other thing. That was the reason God brought the animals by Adam. Now remember, when he brought the animals by, that there weren't 15 species of cows. There was cows. There was the kind. So he didn't have to name off Holstein, and I don't know. I'm not a cow guy, so I can't tell you what the others are. But anyway, whatever they would be, and certainly with dogs, it was the dog, the kind. There hadn't been all of the species that had come from that particular kind. So it wasn't like Adam had to sit there for 85 days naming off every living creature that walked by. But again, the point was to show Adam that creation, as it stood at that juncture, as God identified it, was not good. And that's because there was more that Adam needed than was there. And of course, God had all this in mind. He was like, wow, Adam's missing something. I mean, obviously, God knew what it was, but he wanted Adam to recognize that. But the key about this is it begins in this place called Eden. Now, we talked about this last week. This is the best way I could figure out how to do with what I had available. If you were really creative with graphics and stuff, you could probably come up with a much better thing. I'm stuck with just the charts and stuff that are available on Word and stuff. So this is pretty much what you get. But basically, it is believed, there's no proof of this, but you can't prove one way or another, but it is believed that when God created the earth, or the land, I should say, the land mass, that initially it was a single mass of land. It wasn't divided up into continents, which we see on the map now. And that belief follows through and makes a lot of sense, because until you get to the days of Noah, when obviously the world that existed before the flood versus the world that existed afterwards were two very different worlds. And one of the reasons that we believe the continents came into existence is because we know that when God brought the rains and flooded the earth, we'll be talking a little bit about, we're going to touch on this with Noah, but mostly it's about the sons of Noah that we're going to focus on there. But God didn't just bring the waters from above, he brought water from beneath. In other words, he opened up the water that was kept in the center of the earth. And by doing that, and the water coming over, which flooded the earth, at that time it would have been a single landmass as we're describing here, that this is when the continents were created, and obviously you have what we would call today the seas. We know seas were a part of the creation, so there was certainly salt water, but we didn't have the continents then. So that's basically what's being said. But we know that whatever it was, because it really isn't that significant for us to know, because nobody can describe what they call the antediluvian world, in other words, pre-flood world, because no one was there. And other than a few minor descriptions given, we just don't know. And so for people that come to you and say, well, we know that Eden was by Babylon because of this river and because of that river. Well, those rivers completely changed after the topography of the earth changed because of the flood. So you can't really say for sure that that's where it was. We just don't know. But whatever, we're in Eden right now, and that's where our focus needs to be, okay? So basically all of creation is there. Obviously the whole of the created world was there in Eden and beyond as well. But this was a specific place. It's interesting when you start looking into the rabbis and what they believed was that they believed that Eden was one of the things that God had created before the creation of the world. In other words, he had made this place that he really liked it. It was after the creation of the world that he brought Eden into, that's why he brought it to Adam. In other words, he didn't create it from something that was already there. He had done this beforehand, and he said, this is the place that I want man to live in. It's interesting. Doesn't matter one way or another, but it's just kind of cool to think about it that way. The Torah, which we call law, which the more I learn, the more I study, we really probably shouldn't call it the law, because it's really, the word literally means direction, or specifically direction, or teaching. So of course part of that teaching is the law, and that's why it took on that form. But anyway, so that's one of the two things that were created before the earth was formed, was this Eden. You can take it or leave it, it doesn't matter to us, but it is interesting to think about that God had this place prepared. The reason I'm bringing that up is because why didn't God do all of this stuff in general creation? Within the, why this special place? Well, because Adam was a special creation. And of course, Eve, to fulfill Adam, would be a part of that special creation. And I think that's why he had this place. And I shared with the group before when we did this on the other study that I love this about God, because he could have just done sort of the expected, I guess. Maybe even the mundane, just sort of used all that he'd created, but he had this special place for his special creation. And I sort of have this picture of Adam and just, when God says, yeah, creation is cool, but wait till you see the place that I've got prepared for you. And then you come into the garden and stuff, and Adam sees all of this stuff, and then God is basically saying with the creation of woman, wait till you see what else I have for you. So I just love that concept of God always revealing something new from our perspective. From his perspective, obviously it was planned all along. But I love the fact that he never just sort of just leaves things. He just sort of he throws them out there and in order to awe us, to cause us to be awe-inspired. I love that side of God. So here we go. So in Eden, Adam finds no equal. We already talked about this. I should read the points before I talk about them. He finds no equal in all of creation. Something's missing. All creatures but Adam have a mate. He needs an equal. And obviously that would have been obvious to him as the animals paraded past. So it is in Eden that Eve's body would be formed from the body of Adam, not from the ground as Adam had been. She would be formed with a soul and spirit. So she would be created and formed, already ready to go. The breath of life is in Adam, so God taking the rib from Adam is a part of her now. And that's why Adam would say, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, she's woman, okay? And so then Adam and Eve now have perfect fellowship with one another in the perfect creation, with the perfect provision, in intimacy with their perfect creator. So in other words, this is basically, I'm trying to define, and God said, and God saw that it was good. Okay, I mean, it's exactly as God intended it to be. And so now we would call that perfect. In other words, it was in a state, because we're pre-fall here, remember. So everything was in a state of perfection. Adam and Eve would have been in a state of innocence. So God institutes the principle of marriage, one man marrying one woman. We find that in Genesis as well. They are in the state of innocence without shame or secrets. They are naked. And remember, I shared with you guys, I think we touched on this last week. I don't remember if we got into this, but we certainly did in the study, Knowing Our God study, that the concept of this is that the innocence is the fact that there's nothing hidden. There's nothing to worry about covering up. So it isn't the concept of nudity as we understand it. The idea here is complete innocence. There's nothing to be hidden. So Adam and Eve have everything they could ever want or need. And that's a significant statement because God has to do one other thing in Eden, and of course we're going to talk about that. The Lord has given them complete freedom to choose as they will. They have His likeness, and of course are in His image. They have His likeness, and they are free moral creatures with the freedom to exercise their will. So that statement, and the reason I wanted to put that in there was to make sure that we understood, because there's a lot of misunderstanding as to why, if this was true, why did God put this tree in there that they weren't supposed to? Well, if there's no tree in there, then they have no choice. So they wouldn't be exercising the free will to be like God in his likeness and His image. So the tree was necessary. So 2 trees are planted in Eden, and it is interesting that they are in Eden. Okay, one will lead to life, while the other will lead to death. We're not going to worry about the big long titles. We all know what this, what they represent. That they are told that the only thing forbidden them is the tree of life. Now, the next point is really significant. As free moral beings with the ability to think, choose, and feel, they must choose the will of God, which, of course, is life and represented in the tree of life. They had complete access to that. So they must choose the will of God, which is life and fellowship with their Creator. That choice to stay with that tree and engaged with that tree is basically, I don't want to say it's symbolic, but it certainly represents the concept that they were desiring to be in intimate fellowship with God by being obedient to the things that God had said to them. That's really what's going on here. So to partake of the tree of death, the reason it's called that, would result in their being separated from the Lord God, which would bring death. And we know that the concept of death, it's not a concept, death is a reality, but death, when we look at it as a concept, carries the idea of separation. Dead things don't communicate with that which is alive. It's as simple as that. Okay? And so this is what God said. And you have to remember that when you understand what was really being said there, it's like in the day that you eat of this, in other words, if you reject my will and do this, then there's going to exist a separation. And of course, we know the end of the story, and that's exactly what happened, okay? It is a rejection of the will of God for them to partake of this tree, for them to find themselves at one place forbidden to them in all of creation. So the very fact that they find themselves, and this is the thing I always point out about this story, in all of creation, the one place that we find them is the one place that they should never have been. I mean, there was no reason. They had everything they could possibly want, as we already said, or need in all of the rest of the creation. And yet, where's the one place that we find them? The one place is right there, standing there, gawking at the tree. It's pretty staggering. So they are making the choice to separate themselves from the Lord God by rejecting His will. Now, the question could be asked, well, why does God not stand in the picture? Why do we find the serpent here in the picture instead of God? Well, because He had already told them. And to give them the exercise of that will, which He had given them, meant that He had to let them make the choices, much like the parent allows the child to make the choices, knowing full dang well that they're going to choose the wrong thing. But that's what was going on here. So they're making the choice to separate themselves. The very act of their being in the presence of the one tree is showing that they're tinkering with the idea. And of course, there's a creature called the serpent that is obviously alert to this as well. So here you have this, my other, really cool drawing, or chart, I should say. But within Eden, you have the two, and the difference between them is choice. That's what is really happening what is really happening here. So we've got to get this notion out of our mind that it's about the fruit. The fruit is the consequence of the choice, okay? Because we know the fruit of this tree is not going to lead them where they want. So it's not about the truth. We have this tendency to focus on the fruit. Is it an apple? And of course, it's always portrayed as an apple. It could have been anything. The point is that they were in place now, and whatever it was that they were beholding, they were looking at this thing when they never should have been, whatever it was. Okay? So they were already separating, in a sense, from God. Partaking of the tree was the ultimate step. And of course, this is where the serpent comes in. Okay? So, man, I ran through that fast. That went way faster than I anticipated it would go. I told you it was going to be a short night. I didn't think it was going to be that short. Yes, sir.
So prior to the tree of death, even though they had free will, that they never exercised it then, so right?
Well, they were able to exercise their will, the very fact there, and that's what I'm saying. The exercise of their will led them. In other words, they were already headed towards separating from God. Just by, absolutely, yeah. They were already, yeah, right. And we understand that we don't know what time frame was involved here. I mean, how long were they actually in Eden as husband and wife? We know that they hadn't procreated yet. In other words, we weren't having kids. So we don't know how long of a period of time this was. You know, it could have been days, it could have been months, it could have been years from the way we measure time. Of course, time for them would have been a little different. But the point is that either way, they had already been exercising that choice in the very fact that they had departed from where they wouldn't have gotten themselves into mind. And they had already made that journey, so the exercise of the will is already being expressed, because of course that's the concept of choice. Now it's interesting when you start thinking through all of this, because what you've got is you've got this whole scenario going here, which really, even though we're of course after the fall, hasn't changed much. And I always point this out, so some of you are familiar with this, but it's interesting to me because there's this thing in us, right? This concept of choice that lives within us that always wants to choose what we know we shouldn't choose. Isn't that right? I mean, it's so easy to make the wrong choices. It takes no effort at all. It just comes naturally. Imagine that, because we have a fallen nature. But they didn't have a fallen nature. And yet the propensity was still within them to go ahead and go after that one thing. Now we know that the enemy comes in on this, in the midst of this, and he's working, it's not the enemy himself, it's a serpent. And we know that the serpent is a created being because it's in the garden with them, okay? And we know that whatever it was at that juncture, it's not as we understand it today, right? Because obviously the thing had the ability, and we're told that the serpent was more cunning than the rest. In other words, it had an ability that was at least close to Adam and Eve's, because it had the ability to communicate, unlike, as far as we know at least, the other creatures. We also know it appears to be a bipedal creature. So in other words, it had the ability to walk, because it's there as well. But whatever it was, whatever it looked like, because it's cast onto its belly, it's, so on and so forth. So that tells us that it was something other than what we understand the serpent, which is always interesting, because when you see, when you see pictures of all of this in the children's books or whatever the case may be, we always see it's the snake, because that's how we view when we see the word serpent. But clearly, whatever this thing was, and obviously nobody knows, we're not given any great details about this, whatever it was, it didn't look like a serpent that we understand today. And that's where this concept was. Because it was in the presence of Adam and Eve at the tree, this is why it was believed it at least had the ability to walk. So it was probably had two legs. The bipedal concept comes in. It had the ability to reason, because it was using the information that it was receiving from Lucifer. Because later in the book of Revelation, the last book versus the first book, Lucifer is called that serpent. Okay? So we know he's not a serpent because he's an angelic being. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there was probably, for lack of a better term, they were in cahoots. Okay? That this thing that had the ability to communicate was communicating with Lucifer himself, and he's the one that coaxed it, so he was ultimately behind this thing. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that whatever it was, that when it speaks to Adam and Eve, it's clearly speaking. So whatever it was, unlike the rest of creation, it had the ability to communicate, because it speaks to Eve. And she's not shocked by this. There's no indication in the text that she was appalled or shocked or set back on her heels because this thing starts talking with her. So it brings up some interesting concepts as to whether or not there might have been communication between Adam and Eve and whatever the serpent was prior to this, which is why they were so easily duped by it, so to speak. Don't know. There's no way to know that for sure. But whatever the case may be, whatever it was in communication with them, and obviously it had been in communication with Lucifer, because he's going to be likened to this and the whole deception concept. But it's not Lucifer, because it's not that's just what it was, because angelic beings weren't cast onto their bellies. So whatever it was, it's really quite intriguing. It really doesn't matter, because what we're told is all we need to know. But it is a bit provocative to sort of think about this. But the interesting thing is that there it is at the same place where Adam and Eve are. And then the other issue that comes at this, and we will touch on this when we move into the next part of this, which is why I don't want to really get into all that, which is why I stopped it here tonight, even as short as it is the idea that, I lost my train of thought, but that the concept of this thing dealing and speaking to these guys, and that where is Adam in this? Remember that it was Adam before Eve was brought into the picture. It was Adam that was given dominion. Now that doesn't mean he just had power. We already talked about this a couple of weeks ago. He was in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, he had authority over creation. He was given responsibility for it. Okay? Now Eve would have shared that, but Adam's responsibility would have been to oversee and watch over her. And yet here we find them both at the tree. And again, this is stunning. It's not so big of a deal to us because we live in America. But when I talk about this stuff in third world countries, especially in a place like Africa, they like to point out that the woman was the failure, which is, of course, leads to their belief that woman has half the brain that man does. And it's sad, it's pathetic, I totally agree with that. But, what's that? So, yes, sir?
Would you consider the serpent an indwelling of an evil spirit?
The indwelling of an evil spirit? Yeah, it could be. Like I said, whatever it was part of the created, it was part of the days of creation. So
I'm just thinking about Jesus cast out evil spirits.
Oh, yeah.
And then out of the man, and
They sought another body. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that's what I'm talking about. This whole part of this is really interesting to me. But when you're talking about this idea, of course, this is where the third world, that it was woman that created the fall, and so it's her fault and blah blah blah. They never seem to see that after she partakes of the fruit that she turns and gives to Adam. In other words, Adam is there, but he does nothing. He has the authority to tell the serpent to take a hike. He has the right, he has the ability to stop this thing at any point, and he fails to do so. So when you start thinking about all this, and then you start thinking about Paul talking about the first Adam in Romans and stuff, you start getting this concept, because there's never any blame that's placed on the woman. It's always placed on Adam. Why? Because he was the one that was responsible for making sure that this didn't happen, and he failed to do so. We're going to be talking next week. By doing that, he usurped his dominion and handed it over to Lucifer himself, which is why Jesus refers to him as the God of this world. That dominion was given over. Yes, ma'am.
So when did Lucifer fall?
Well, probably before. Yeah, there's a lot of banter back and forth of this. And again, nobody can say for sure. And anybody that tells you they know is wrong. It's just that simple.
But when he fell, he had, don't you think his image changed? I mean, he was a beautiful creation.
Yeah, he still is.
He's still beautiful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he still has that angelic form. No, that's our rendition of what it would look like because he's evil. No, because it's where is it? Where's it said? Is it? If anybody knows, I want to say it's Ezekiel.
He comes as an angel of light.
Well, he appears as an angel of light. That's in Paul and Corinthians. But there's an Old Testament passage that talks about Lucifer. I think it's Ezekiel, and where he shows up, and everybody's looking at him now in judgment, and they said, and this is the man. So he still, has that. When the angels appear, they appear as men, and so he still has that. So he didn't get the forked tail and the horns like we all like to see. He's still a radiant, shining being, which is what Lucifer means, by the way, it's the shining one. So the fall is, the banter is, well, was he created, were the angels, and therefore the fall took place before the creation of the world and the cosmos and the heavens? Or there are those that say that because of the creation of man, this is what led to the fall of Lucifer. Because as the angels, we know from the book of Job, in chapter, I think it's 38 in Job, the angels are clapping their hands, which there's no distinction there between fallen or otherwise, that they're just captivated by God creating. And the idea then goes on, and again, there's no way to prove or disprove this. It's just, this is stuff that people want to argue about. But the idea that Lucifer was created before all of this, and was everything was happy, and was apparently, he thought that he was the one that was going to inherit the earth, that it was going to be given to him. There's, again, no way to know that. I guess it kind of makes sense. And what upset him, and he decided that he was going to become his own God, which of course we get from Isaiah, is the concept that God had created man in his image and likeness, and this caused Lucifer to, who knows? We just don't know. But we do know that the angelic beings were created before, because they watched as God filled the heavens. Remember, he had formed the heavens on day 1. He fills them on day 4. And they were clapping their hands as God was doing all this. They were standing in amazement. So they were clearly created at some juncture in there. So again, where this ties in with the serpent, it's not known, but whatever, we know that the New Testament ties that this whole thing that was going on with the serpent, that it was Lucifer that was directly responsible for it. And therefore that Adam was directly responsible because of the dominion and the authority that he had been given by God, which is why Eve is never, she's never held accountable for this, because it falls on Adam. And so this whole concept that Paul deals with, the idea of the first Adam, because of the first Adam, he brought sin and death into the world. And of course, if you separate, right, death, if you separate yourself from God, who is life, and perfection and all of these things, which is what the fall is, the ultimate results of that, then what you're doing then is you're opening it up to what we see in the world today with death and deformity and decay and blah, blah, blah. And we could go on and on. Disease, the whole thing that comes on with that. But this instance, when you're looking at all of this conversation that is taking place between Adam and Eve and the serpent, and whatever he was, whatever it represented, again, there's the opportunity for Adam to step up to the plate, and he simply fails to do so. So the serpent takes advantage. But you got to remember that this is in the framework of pre-fall. This is before the curse has entered into the picture. Because we know that the consequences of the fall are just enormous. I mean, it doesn't take very long outside the gates of Eden, which of course they're removed from and they're not allowed to go back in. We'll be dealing with a little more of that later. But as they're moved out, that they're kept from going back. But it doesn't take very long for Adam and Eve to have 2 sons. And this time the words is said that Adam had a son in his image and likeness rather than God's. And that's interesting because now Adam is a fallen being, right? He's a fallen creature. And in his image and likeness, well, you end up with Cain. And so, as a consequence of the fall, of disobeying and choosing to reject the will of God.
Paint me a picture of where Satan is at this time, because this is Satan's second abode.
Absolutely. And he's got a final abode.
So he had already fallen. Okay?
Yeah.
So there was sin there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And we know that actually there's more abodes, because there's later he's going to be cast into into the abyss. There we go. I'll get it here in a minute. The abusas, but he'll be thrown into there. But then he's released, and then his ultimate abode, his eternal abode, is the lake of fire. Yeah.
What is amazing is that Satan is still allowed in the presence of God, or
It does appear so. Yeah. Absolutely.
all of us day and night. But when he gets kicked out of heaven,
Yeah.
he will, in Revelation,
Yeah. In the book of Revelation, yeah, he's tossed out.
It's going to be. Going to be a little upset.
Yeah, the accuser of the brethren. I mean, there you go. And to think about this from the very beginning here, we're talking about that he already had his fingers in the pie, so to speak, and trying to thwart all this, and it makes you wonder, because obviously he's angelic. He's obviously an intelligent being, but really, because he seems like kind of a dummy to me. Because, I mean, obviously he's completely oblivious to the plan of God. Because if you know what the plan of God is, you're not going to lead Adam and Eve to fall. Because if you lead Adam and Eve to fall, that means God's going to bring a Redeemer who's ultimately going to smash your head. Hello. So how much he knew of the plan of, well, it tells us he knew, if he knew any at all, he knew very little. Because it's not very bright, dude, to go in there and do this and pull Adam and Eve out of there, because God already had the answer to that. And the answer to that is your destruction. So what kind of a being with intelligence would do something like that? So
Doesn't it show how big pride is, though?
absolutely,
Sin is,
absolutely.
How big sin is. Number one sin is pride. And that's what he fell into.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he was we read in the scripture that he was probably the way we understand it, he was the greatest, the most beautiful of all of creation, and it went to his head, which tells you that, obviously they have choice and stuff, what they don't have is the Spirit of God, angels, in other words, because they're not in God's image and likeness. But yeah, so you think you really sit and noodle this through, and you're thinking, boy, this guy is just not that, he's just not that smart, and all this idea that he knows the plan. No, he doesn't. He just doesn't get it.
How can he not know his future?
He's oblivious to it. The coolest answer to that I ever.
Listen on Sunday mornings?
He does, but he's arrogant enough to do. Because listen, if he had listened, because we talk about New Testament times, but think about the Old Testament. And there's a passage that Paul writes about this. I want to say it's Colossians. I don't know, but it's in there. Trust me, where. That if the principalities and powers, of course, speaking of the spiritual realm, if they had knew what the cross meant, they would have never allowed Jesus to go to the cross. So here's Lucifer. He's this goofball in the garden, and then of course he's going to do all of this stuff later. That's going to lead to his demise, which is going to because of the seed of the woman. So he's going to have to try to stop the seed of the woman throughout history, which he's done until the seed of the woman showed up in the Lord Jesus Christ. And then he thinks he's got him whooped. He tries to get him on the temptation up on the mount, right? He tries to get him there. He can't get him there. And then what he does is he said, well, we'll just kill him and get him out of the picture. And so he puts him on the cross. And that's what Paul is writing about. If he had understood what that meant, he would have never allowed them to go he would have done anything in his power to keep Jesus from going to the cross. Yeah.
Well, it always appeared to me in Scripture that angels have no foresight.
Yeah.
They can't see.
They can't, yeah. And so what ends up happening is this guy has led to his own demise since the moment he spoke to them in the garden. It's like, wow. The wisdom of God, the wisdom of man is foolishness to God, and the wisdom of God is foolishness to man. The coolest thing, and I'm trying to remember exactly how this goes, but you remember C.S. Lewis's the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Do you remember the story, especially the new one they came out with? The one that's not cartoon, let me put it that way. What do you call that? Real? It's not animated, whatever it was. It was really interesting because the statement is made at the end of the movie, and I don't remember the two characters that are talking about. We know Aslan is the lamb, right? The lion. And the queen of the winter, she slays him and all that stuff. And then he comes up and he basically overcomes her. And the question is asked to the guy at the end of the movie, the little girl, she asks, how could he have done this if he had known? And it said because he doesn't read. He doesn't understand it. And I thought, wow. So like many people that read the scripture and never understand the thing they just read, but think they're knowledgeable in it, it's that way. Another really cool thing I saw was the strangest thing to tie this to, but ties into Serpent as well. I happened to be watching one of these National Geographic or whatever deals, and it was on snakes, serpents, right? And it talked about how the snake is so aggressive in its nature. In particular, this was a rattlesnake, that even if the head is cut off, that it will continue to fight. It will continue to do this, and it doesn't know that it's been separated from the body. And it went through this whole thing, and they chopped the head of the snake off. And as the head was doing this, and still had its fangs out, the body of the snake that had been chopped off comes by, and the fangs latch into its own body, and it's pumping all of the poison into its own body because it's completely oblivious to the fact that it's been separated from itself. And I thought, that's Lucifer. That's exactly what it is. He doesn't have a clue. So you think, well, she should be listening to us. He's not going to listen to you, The very fact that he's got the pride issue, why would he listen to us? But that's exactly what he's done. He cut his own head off, and he's latched onto himself, and he's pumping venom into the very plan that he, quote unquote, thinks that he has, completely oblivious to the fact. But in Revelation, as Cecil brought up, we know that when he's cast out of heaven, that's where we read, he knows, at that point, he knows his time is short. That's when it finally registers. How do you wrap your brain around that? I mean, this is just stunning. But from the very moment the serpent approaches Adam and Eve in the garden, right, he's already losing his head. And he's poisoning everything that he wants to do from that get-go. You would think if he had any intelligence at all, he'd let him alone. Or at least not had anything to do with them, because they'd have probably done it without him. We don't know, but so there's all of these concepts that are going on. And of course, right out of the garden, I don't know, it makes you wonder, and we're going to be talking about the curse and later, but it makes you wonder after this has all happened, when God brings the curse, it makes you wonder if Lucifer wasn't standing there thinking, oh good, I got God to go against Adam and Eve, right? She's going to have to bear children through pain and suffering, and Adam, stinking Adam, weeds, and sweat of the brow and all of that stuff, right? It was his fault, thorns and thistles. But you got to wonder if Lucifer wasn't sort of standing, or the serpent, in cahoots with Lucifer, wasn't standing back going, I got him, Now, if this idea that he thought that the earth was being created for him to rule, which is why, makes you wonder if that was maybe what he thought, that he's just going, oh, now they have failed, I will get this. But then the Lord turns to him and he's not given an option to come clean like Adam and Eve were. The serpent's the seed of the woman's going to come and crush your head. Makes you wonder.
I guess I always had this idea, and it's probably misconceived, but that when he did this betrayal of God, part of him died, or that spiritual part of him kind of died like it did with us, but maybe that's not true with angelic beings.
Yeah, it's something very similar. That's what I meant, that when he sinned, but through his pride, whenever that was, that it implies, and again, I don't mean to say he's stupid, please don't misunderstand, but he's kind of clueless in a lot of things. It's almost as though when that happened, he lost, whatever ability he had to reason with truth.
That's the thing about pride.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So then you mentioned that anyway, that, when we're prideful, we don't get what it means to be humble.
Yeah, it just bounces off you because you don't need any information. You've already got it all, right? So that's a really good point. And and Jesus called him the father of lies. He's been lying since the beginning. Jesus said.
Stupid, then we're stupid.
Because we listen to what he has to say, what he throws out there in front of us to offer us. Yeah.
The amazing thing about it is that he can only go as far as God lets him.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What kind of brainstorm could that be?
Yeah.
Not too smart.
Yeah. Well, once the Lord was on the cross, and they thought, you think about all of this, and the first thing he was like probably thinking after this, the curse of the seed of the woman and stuff. He's like, man, what was I thinking? So he goes all through centuries, and then Jesus shows up, and he thinks, oh, finally put him in the ground, and then the resurrection happens, and he's like, oh man, what was I thinking? it's like you're biting yourself, dude. Can you not understand this? It's just amazing. But that's what happens when you putz around with the truth. Right? I mean, and I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, but is this not the problem with cults? They take a portion of the truth, but they've got their minds made up because pride has entered the picture. They've got their minds made up. They're not going to embrace truth. And so what they do is they distort, they manipulate, they twist, whatever you want to call it, the truth, and base their whole thing on this newfound revelation without realizing that their head's been cut off and they're poisoning the very thing that they're trying to establish. I mean, yeah, so if you want to dink around with the truth, things are probably not going to turn out really well for you. And which, I'll put a hook in for starting tomorrow night, we're going to be looking at this concept in these Hebrew words, and it just so happens that truth pops up. Oh, I could have some fun with this. No, I'm not going to do it. It'll take too long. But No, because if I start going now, I won't be able to finish it because there's just too much. Anyway,
At the end of tonight, continue tomorrow.
yeah. Well, we're going to go in there and we're going to look at what was actually happening. And I pointed this out to you guys. There's that little word that was in the Hebrew, it's aleph tav. And there's that little thing in there that, you know, in particular the Jews have tried to tell us, well, it's just a direct object. Well, they're full of poo-poo because it's not. I mean, it's the direct object in the sense that it points to a direct object. And you got to come to Wednesday nights, you're going to get to understand that. But when you see that and understand what that is and understand that the rest that God is going to do throughout the Old Scripture, we'll never see it in English because all the Hebrew scholars will tell you that this, and it's pronounced it's aleph taf, the two letters aleph taf, the A and the T, first and last. I'll just tantalize you with that. But the aleph taf that shows up in the Hebrew in the days of creation is that you can't. It's untranslatable into English. There's no English equivalent for it. But when you look at the Hebrew and you understand what it is, it pops up everywhere. And it always pops up with people that are in covenant relationship with God. It's stunning. It's absolutely amazing. Yeah?
But the other issue, I think, with Satan, there's no grace.
Absolutely. Good point.
With man, when we sin, there is still grace available to us.
That's right.
But with Satan, he doesn't learn from his consequences because there's no grace.
Exactly. And you just brought up a really good point because that's the contrast between law and grace. Because of Lucifer, prior to Messiah coming to earth, the Redeemer coming to the earth, the seed of the woman, prior to that, Lucifer was there, and like you said, unbending, no unmerciful, blah, 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 right? And you go there, well, what was the period what did God establish that was going to get the people through? Law. But the law was unbending. Break the law, suffer the consequences. Grace was not an issue. Mercy was not an issue, at least from their understanding of the law. So you've got this hard contrast in the Old Testament before the seed of the woman enters the picture. You've got this hard, unmerciful God of this world now, Lucifer, and world history proves that out. And then you've got this unbending, ungiving thing that God put to battle that, which is called the law. And both of those are done away with at the cross because now grace enters the picture. Law has served its purpose. It's still God's law. It's still the standard, but the law no longer sits in judgment of us because grace has entered the picture. So yeah, and it all starts, back there in the harshness of what sin brings. Sin brings the curse, and the curse, of course, is because of Lucifer, not because of, but part of the thing on Lucifer, and of course Adam and Eve as well. And so it's hard. There's no give to it. And it's just that's why it's so harsh when you read in the Old Testament and God tells them, you go in there and you kill every one of them, man, woman, and child. And we think, oh my gosh, And of course this is the argument that the atheists use against, well, you're just like the Muslims because your God told you. Well, yeah. But what they don't understand is the difference is our God, those children were safe with God, even though their parents were worshiping things and about ready to throw them in the fire for sacrifice. See, we always lose that side of it. But anyway, so, God seems so harsh in the Old Testament, so completely different than the way he is in the New Testament with grace. Well, that's because redemption has been completed. It's been fulfilled, which is why Jesus said, it is finished. Hello? So the law had served its purpose. It had pointed to the cross. It had done all the stuff that it was supposed to do, showing us not only how important the cross was, but why we needed the cross. Why we needed the cross? In other words, why we needed the Redeemer? Because we can't keep the law. We don't have the ability to keep the law.
What's amazing to me is when Jesus was up on the mountain and Satan appeared, there with him, and he said, bow down to me and I'll give you all of it.
Yeah.
What is it up with you? It isn't yours to give.
Yeah. Well, actually, at that point it was. At that point it was, yeah.
He was trying to be God.
Yeah.
Say, hey, I can give you.
Yeah, well, he was trying to divert the crop. He was trying to divert the whole concept of redemption because, if we just do this the easy way. If this is the world you want, I can give that world to you if that's what you want. I mean, that's what's going on. It's really sad. The interesting thing, then we all know this, that Jesus defeated him not by smacking him around, which I would have done, but he defeated him by the word. He defeated by truth. It's truth, always. Yeah, she had her hand. Oh, okay.
It has to do with grace
Okay.
in the Old Testament. So The only place I see grace, and maybe you call it mercy, is that God would, with Israel, say, if you turn back, then I'll restore you. So is that grace? Or
Absolutely, grace and restoration. So grace is not just a New Testament concept, but it doesn't take on a new meaning. How can we say this? Grace in the Old Testament is like a rose, bud. Is that what you call them when they're not, before they open? Rose bud. It's there, it's beautiful, it's got all of the stuff, and we see God exercising grace, even in the midst of the harshness of the law. We see him exercising grace. Exercise of grace, why not stomp out the Israelites? Why would you not stomp those guys out? They were a bunch of whiners, and that's what God said, I'm going to do that. And Moses said, now wait a minute here. Obviously, God wasn't going to do this. He was giving Moses an opportunity to intercede, but the point is, so grace is there. But that bud in the New Testament, grace is extended with Abraham on Mount Moriah, with Isaac. Grace is extended in the fact that Adam and Eve survived to be the progenitors of, ultimately Eve in particular, the seed of the woman. So you see grace, it's just not as flowered, what's the word? Blossomed, whatever, I don't know. I'm not a real flower guy. Not a cow guy, not a flower guy. But that's what, it's really interesting. And the whole concept of chesed, which is Hebrew for mercy, it's wow. It's stunning. We're going to have some fun with that stuff in the next few weeks. Yeah.
Okay, so the Bible tells us that a third of the angels went with Lucifer.
Right.
And that they were cast out of heaven. Does that say that or not? Does it not say
No,
that?
they just followed him. Oh, that's what you call the demonic realm, the unclean
But
spirits.
aren't they, they're right here with us?
Yeah, they're absolutely,
Were they
yeah.
cast out of heaven to earth?
Yeah, I mean, but whether or not they have access to God's presence as Lucifer does, we don't know. Because we know he does, because he's the accuser of the brethren. The only way he accuses is to be before the throne. So it would appear that there is access, which is why the throne is guarded by Michael and guys you don't want to mess with. But they're certainly at work within the spiritual realm, which is the whole concept of principalities and powers and blah, blah, blah. There's a hierarchy within the spiritual realm, of which, of course, Lucifer's first. What's interesting is he didn't seem to have, because we always want to give him all authority over the evil realm, the dark realm of darkness or spiritual, darkness is part, whatever. But what's interesting is, and we won't get into this whole thing, but you've got these interesting characters that show up in Genesis 6 called the sons of God. And they're doing something that's really unusual, because whatever it is, it leads to an attempt, at least, to change the created order, which tells us they can't be human, because humans don't change the created order, no matter how much they try or think they can. So something is going on there. But what's interesting is Lucifer doesn't pay for this, because this ultimately is what leads to the flood. We'll do more on that when we get to Genesis 6, which should be in a week or two here. So, but what's really interesting about this is whoever these guys were, they apparently were even worse than Lucifer. Because the act that they did, we're told in Jude and in the New Testament, they have been reserved in chains unto darkness. These guys have been locked up. So there apparently was a group, I don't know if group is the right word to use, but apparently there was some angels that didn't want to follow even the path of Lucifer. They decided they were going to take it upon themselves, and they brought judgment. They're locked away. They're held in reserve until the judgment. They don't get an option. They're not free to roam. So that tells you these dudes, if Lucifer's a bad dude, and he's a bad dude, these guys were really bad dudes. This was literally the Hell's Angels. Okay? I mean, these were some bad hombres. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been locked away. What they did, God said, I will not tolerate that.
Some interpreters that I've read about say that they think demons will be released when Satan is kicked out.
It's part of the book of Revelation with the key to the bottomless pit, and that some of these guys come out. But it's not these guys, because these guys are reserved until judgment. They don't get to see anything until judgment. But there's other things that are going on there. But so within the spiritual realm, and then you get, of course, the realm of the evil spirits, and the demons, and then you have unclean spirits, and there's the Hebrews believe that there's the different areas in these.
So the angels that followed Lucifer, they're not the demons?
Some would interpret them as demons. Yeah. Others would interpret them as evil spirits. It depends on who you're reading. All we know is there's a supernatural realm out there, and these guys are privy to that. But again, it goes back to principalities and powers. So this hierarchy. So are demons higher than evil spirits? Some would say yes, others would say no. And some would say they're the same dang thing. Well, there seems to be a difference. The ones that you were describing before seem to be evil spirits that were looking for something to, because that's what Jesus said. And you know, when an evil spirit is cleansed out, he's going around looking for something else. So that seems to be, and some would say it's a demonic, but he doesn't use that word there. So it's really interesting when you start getting into all of this. But we don't, you know, the reason I don't really get into this is because we have enough to worry about within the physical realm to worry about the spiritual realm. There's enough issues here. So, anything else? Yes, sir.
Law and grace, like, with the law, is basically for the Jews.
Well, not for the Jews. It was for because there were many that embraced Judaism, which we've talked about in our study on Genesis.
You never hear anything about that when you read about it. Because
Right.
all the other people,
Yeah.
non-Jews, you want to call them.
Right.
So the law.
The proselytes, those that wanted to become Jews that weren't Jews. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I was saying, okay, the law is specifically for the Jewish population.
Right.
And it wasn't available, or it wasn't, I want to screw up the other people.
Well, it's not that it wasn't available. It was the Jews were given the responsibility to live the law so that the nations would be drawn to that. But they made the law even more stringent than law by its nature is. They made it so much more stringent that the nations didn't want to have anything to do with it.
The rest of the world.
Right. But there were Gentiles that we call proselytes that wanted to, that recognized that the God of Israel is the God of Israel. And so they would have embraced the law and understood the law and tried to live by the law, which is of course what Paul did prior to his conversion. So, but the law had this incredible purpose. It served its purpose. And Paul very clearly tells us it's a teacher. In Galatians, he said the law was the tutor. Well, what was it teaching us? It was teaching us that we can't keep it.
So, even though God had grace at that time,
Mm-hmm.
at different times chose to
Right.
provide.
The law was still the standard.
The law was still
That's right.
When Jesus died on the cross,
Yeah.
and the law's out of the way, and we come to the Lord through grace.
Right.
And that Christ died on the cross for us.
That's right. Now remember that the law still functions for those that are not in Christ. So the law will still judge because that's God's standard.
Even yet today.
Even today, if you die without Christ, it will be the law that judges you, and of course Christ who fulfilled the law. Yeah. So-
If you die without Christ, you don't have grace.
Absolutely. Yeah, so you're under law. Yeah, and the law takes no prisoners. It says guilty. And that's what those that reject Christ are. They're guilty. All right? Cool. Anything else real quick? Well, let's turn into a Q&A night, huh? This always worries me because I'm like, please don't let him ask a question I don't know the answer to. Please don't. Because it's like, man, there's so much stuff. Yeah.
What he was talking about was people outside Israel recognizing God when God was nature written.
Yeah, the nature, absolutely.
And Nebuchadnezzar recognized who God was. And
Darius, yeah.
recognized who
Absolutely.
God was.
Yeah.
And throughout history, because they all came from Noah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they went various places.
Yeah, absolutely.
At least in my belief, I believe that there are people out there who still recognize who God
Oh,
is,
absolutely.
even though they had no
Yeah.
relationship with it.
That's exactly right. Well, and that's why I took the time when we were looking at the forming and the filling of the heavens, that the heavens are speaking constantly about who God is, and there's no place that their voice isn't heard. What part of no place do people not understand? So, all right. All right, well, let's pray. Father, thanks for tonight.